Our second set of warm-ups are a little more strenuous, have a little more to do with developing power and strength really from the joints. Range of motion is still unforced. We don't want to feel like we're tensing up or stiffening up to affect any of the ranges of motion. I'm going to start off a little in the wider stance. So again, I can just step out or I can toe out and bring the heels out. That'd be about the minimum width typically, right? If it feels a little too wide for you, then it probably is. But if I go a little wider, I'm going to sit down a little deeper. Tailbone dropping under the body and also sitting back slightly in the hips. Whenever I sit or squat down, the head feels like it's moving straight down towards the floor, but the hips will sit back a little bit, which helps me get the tailbone dropped under. And the trick is to find this posture, the head carriage, the opening and releasing of the back in such a way that it keeps my weight even toe to heel. And that by sitting back into the hips, my weight doesn't come back into my heels, which can take a little while. I can even do that a few times, just looking for that feeling. As the tailbone drops under, it'll help the legs open up into that rounded arch, putting the feet right over the knees, or rather the knees right over the feet, and the knees always pointing the same direction as the toes. Feels a little like I'm sitting in the saddle, and it's a very moderate version of the horse riding stance. I can place my hands on the hip bones now, and then I'm going to sink my weight a little bit more into one leg. Feel as if the tissues in that leg are gently being compressed like a spring, not stiffly, but with that springy force that I can then release, and it brings me back up through the center. And then releasing all the way down from the top, sink through the other leg. Let it gently compress, especially in the ankle, in the arches of the feet, and up in the hip area, and then release back up to the center. Don't generally want to look for that feeling of compression in the knees. Knees should feel as open and light as possible. But feel that coordination of the foot and ankle, the lower calf, and the hip, the lower back. Releasing down from the top, releasing up through the center, up from the feet. We sink down, often we say sink with the hips and shoulders, elbows, knees, and hands and feet. Hips and shoulders soften, elbows, knees, hands, and feet. I can feel the weight of the arms sinking into the hip bones, and then just traveling down with the rest of the body weight through the feet. The lighter leg stays evenly balanced on the floor, meaning it doesn't roll in, the weight stays even. So about 70% of my weight shifts over as I sink down on that side. The 30% that's left is even on that foot. When I release back up to the center, it's up through the feet, up through the body, up through the crown of the head. Eventually, we'll also see it's out through the arms. Up here, you're not going to feel that particularly where they're placed. Then I'm going to pause in the middle and look for something very similar as I turn side to side. Turning left and right. I'm keeping my body in the center. The turning is all coming from the hip joints. So if my hands are on my hip bones, the hip joint is right under them. It's right below that, right at the top of the thigh where that crease is. And everything from my hip bones up is just riding along with that one piece. So my hips and shoulders, there's no twist. The head too, just riding along with it, not leading with my head or my shoulders, no twist at my waist. And no real twist in my knees either. So as I turn to the B side here, the opposite knee is going a little forward towards the toes, but not inward. I turn back to the A side, that knee comes back toward the heel a little bit. And the B side, that knee comes forward towards the toes. I don't try to hold my legs apart, but dropping the tailbone under the body, finding that big rounded arch as part of the basic posture will keep the knees gently tracking forward and backward. Never very far, an inch or so. Never out past the toes, and certainly never wobbling inward. And then if I add this to the weight shift, it becomes a little more challenging. I get a much bigger opening and stretch of my hip. So when I was turning in the center, I would notice that one side I'm folding the body into the upper thigh. On the other side, it's the opposite. Bring the lower body away from the upper thigh. So it feels like it's a hinge or a gate that's opening up on one side, closing up on the other. And when I turn back, it reverses. So I get a very gentle stretch in the front of the hip on the side that I'm turning away from, the opposite side from the turn. And when I add the weight shift in, it's even more obvious. Really a little bit more of a stretch there, but I have to really relax and sink down through that back hip and leg. Keep that back foot on the floor. And again, I can release up to the center, sinking down, turning to the other side. Release down, hips, shoulders, elbows, knees, hands, feet. Release up from the foot, up through the leg and torso, down to the other side. I can add a little arm swing here, which makes it harder to keep track of what's happening with my legs. And what's happening in terms of the knee position, the hips, far more important than the arms. But try to keep my attention, in particular, still on that back hip. The arms will just swing, relaxed, heavy, but not quite slack. So if I keep the palms a little spread out, it helps me avoid any slackness in the arm and shoulder. And this percussion helps relax, improve the circulation through the hip area. I'm still releasing up through the center, and here I can start to feel that release up through the torso and out through the arms. And then as I relax and soften, it's hips, shoulders, elbows, knees, hands, and feet all together. So up kind of linear, up from the ground, down, very holistic, very arms and legs together. Feeling that pumping action in the feet, ankles, lower calf, feeling that pumping action in the upper thigh, hip, lower back region. Now stand body width or maybe a little bit wider. And we're going to work again on that rotation of the hips. So first I'm going to turn to the A side, turn the back foot in. Toe in just a little bit, whatever's comfortable. But I should feel like both hips are folding in together. It's never just one hip moving at a time. And then as I let my weight sink into that leg, I keep turning to the A side. Now both hips are opening out. Both hips folding in like two gates swinging shut, and then both swinging open. Even though I only see one leg moving at a time, what I feel is very clearly in both hips. And again, it's that back hip that's actually the key one. Feeling like that swinging open and bringing my lower body away from that thigh. Now they're both folding in, now they're opening out. Our attention tends to go to the front of our body, but here we really want to pay attention to the back of the body. I can let the arms swing again, as long as it's not too distracting from paying attention to what's happening in my legs and hips. So as I turn, I never feel that back knee twisting in. I never feel the foot rolling in or the hip swinging out to the side. Everything stays in a nice clear line, sort of like the fence post, very erect and stable. I want to become a little aware of that up-down dynamic as well. So as I first shift the weight, sink into the new leg, but then release up. Very subtle at this point, down, up. But the eyes can help guide that. The eyes a little bit lower in the transition, then my gaze lifts very slightly as I turn out and release up through the body. And if I lift my gaze a little bit more, my arms swing up a little higher, patting the rib area. So my head lifts, the upper spine extends very, very slightly. Still the tailbone dropping under the body, lower back nice and stable. There's no real movement from the waist here. Bringing my gaze a little higher still, the front hand will swing up to the inside of the opposite shoulder. The back hand sitting right at the back of the waist. And a little higher still, the upper hand's going to hit right at the top of the shoulder near the base of the neck. Back hand still the back of the waist, lower back area. Really trying to make sure that shoulder stays sinking down as much as it can, doesn't hike up, and that it doesn't wrap too far around the body, not letting the shoulder blade sort of pull to the front, but keeping that shoulder sinking. The arms long enough to reach there without having to reach around and lose control of the shoulder. So the crown of the head's rising up because the chin is in, the back is rounded, and the shoulders can always sink away from the head as the head gently floats up. And now we're going to return to a little looking down and looking up, like in the basic warm-ups. Open the back, gather the front, open the front, gather the back. This time, noticing how when I look down a little bit, I'm loading my legs. Right, so the hips and knees, ankles are flexing slightly. And when I look up, I'm releasing up from the ground again. Opening the front of the body, gathering the back, chin still a little in, eyes not too high, tailbone dropping under, and no really tipping forward or backward ever from the waist. Right? From the upper spine, from the hips, yeah, but not from the waist area so much. Releasing down into the ground, building up that spring-like compression, and using that to release back up again. Eventually, I can extend my hips a little bit more, so I'm tilted back, not from the lower back, but from the hip. And let the arms extend back, come up over the top, and then a little forward again. Not bowing forward too much, but returning to a more upright position and letting the hands sink down. As the hands come down, I'm releasing down to the ground again, and then I'm going to release up and come back to the middle position. So we're not going to do it too continuously. We're going to have a little bit of pause each time, finding the center again. And then a little down, load the legs, release up, open. As the arms come up, again, the shoulders are sinking as much as possible. Back opening as the front closes, release down, and release back up into the neutral position. Load the legs. Release back up into the neutral position. Some of these bigger movements, you might find your breath falling in time with the movement. That's fine. Just go slow enough that your breath is nice and slow and deep. So even as I look up, I feel like the fullness of my breath is down in my belly. That all comes really from head carriage and pelvic tilt. Same postural cues. I can develop this squatting. Right? It's a very subtle squat right now. I can gather in like I'm catching a ball and then rolling that ball down the front of my body. And as I do that, I'm starting to squat. And squatting, as mentioned before, we always sit back into the hips a little bit. Sitting back into the hips means I have to figure out how to keep my weight even toe to heel, not letting all my weight go back. That has to do, again, head carriage, releasing the shoulders, tailbone dropping under the body as the back opens and releases. Feeling that slight arch. It's not a very wide stance, but there's still an arch connecting the two thighs. Coming down as far as is comfortable and making sure if my weight's getting onto my heels, I shouldn't go lower until I work out that challenge. If I do go lower, making sure that it's not too stressful. I'm not tensing up, right, to try to keep my balance, and I'm not holding my breath. You can hear me, I'm speaking very normally in a light, normal tone. So I'm not breathing hard as I do this. And however far down is comfortable. The crown of my head is always just dropping straight down towards the floor, but the hips are sitting back behind me. That way my knees never go past my toes. Better to go down just a little bit with good form than to try to get way down. I'm not going to go too far down right now. We're going to come into another variation. You can see each time I rise up, my hands are falling right through that center point. So here I was moving a little more continuously, but if I needed to, I could pause each time, start by looking down, loading the legs, and do that full cycle. It's not absolutely necessary. What works best for you on a given day. The next version is starting the same way. Again, no bend from the back. Bowing forward now a little bit as I squat. So my hips are going back, but my head is definitely coming slightly forward. Arms are diving forward, like diving into a pool, except the palms are turning slightly out. My head and my shoulders never hang loose. So nothing is slack, just like nothing is stiff. And the roll of the spine comes from the top, from the base of the head down through the neck, through the upper back, middle back. Not so much from my lower back, because again, I want to avoid bending at the waist significantly. But I can bend a lot from my hips. So that's the squatting portion. Then roll back up, hands passing through that center. Again, I can either pause and start again by loading the legs and opening up, coming over the top. Or I can do it more continuously. Now, as I start to rise up, release up through the legs. Again, not forcing the range of motion, keeping it comfortable. Eventually, you may find you can go quite deep without working too hard. So if you can make it all the way down, again, there's no rush. You can even grab the tops of the feet and now straighten the legs a little bit, looking slightly forward, and then relax down and lift. I'm not going to do too many of those because not everybody's going to be doing them initially. I'll show it one more time, bowing and squatting, and eventually I just grab the top of my feet, straighten the legs gently, back relatively straight, the chin is floating back and in, bring the head away from the body, and I can pump once or twice or even 3 times. And then when I come up, I do not feel like I'm doing the work with my back. And that brings us into the last variation, where my legs don't squat particularly. Rolling from the top, keeping the legs relatively straight, though not locked. Palms turning out. Once I'm getting lower, I start to lift my head a little bit and initiate that lift from the top and roll it down through the spine and not, again, lifting with my back at all. Not too big a bend at the waist. Very little. Keep the legs straight this time. See the little bit of difference between when I bow and squat together. Lift the head, roll that movement from the top down. I'm rising up, but the movement starts at the top of the spine. Comes down. Now with all the squatting, we want to make sure the legs are not getting too stiff and tight. So starting in a slightly wider bodyweight stance again, I can turn out to the side, sit into that back leg, bowing forward, and let that lift my front toes. I'm turning my hips towards the foot that's turned out. So that back hip has to swing open again like a hinge. The knee shouldn't roll in, the hip shouldn't sway out. So that leg just stays like a fixed post, hinging at the hip. And I bring my hands to my lower back and just bow forward, sitting back. That lifts the front toes. The chin is still floating back. Keep my head in line with my body and not sag forward. No bend at the waist. And I try to let my breath get down into my belly and even more significantly, sort of into my lower back. Feel like I'm breathing into my lower back to help relax and fill it up. In the beginning, maybe just 2 or 3 breaths. Then dropping the toes, that'll help bring my body up straight. Go in, turn out to the other side, pivoting on the heel. Sit back and bow forward. Again, I'll just do a few breaths. Over time, I could build up. And that feeling of deep breathing, unforced though, free up the whole back of the whole lower back, back of the hip area. Rising up. Now I'm going to step my back foot a little further back, keep the weight forward, feet roughly parallel. I'm going to turn my hips to the front again, but trying to keep the tailbone dropping under the body, which is difficult in this position. And let the weight sink through that back heel, stretching out both the back of the leg, but also the front of the hip. If the tailbone doesn't drop under the body, I won't really be stretching out of the front of the hip at all, which will include the psoas muscle, that deep hip abdominal muscle that controls so much of what's happening in the lower back. So think of it as actively sinking the weight through that back heel, but without stiffening up. Then I'm going to bend my back knee, let that heel come up off the floor. And then again, sink the weight through the heel, even though it's not touching the floor. So with my knee bent, thinking of the heel pressing down towards the floor again, but without touching it. And feeling how the pull in the back of the leg shifts from the thicker part of the calf below the knee down to the lower calf and the back of the ankle area, moving from that thicker gastrocnemius muscle to the deeper, flatter soleus muscle, which is actually the more important muscle. And I'll go to the other side. I could have done this right after the bowing forward, but just to keep the number of things we're doing at a time simple. So again, taking one big step back, weight forward, hips turning gently towards the front. That helps stretch out that back leg, dropping the tailbone under, and that's affected really as much by my head carriage as anything else. Moving my weight forward, but sinking that back heel down into the floor. Put my hands on my lower back to help me feel that area relaxed, but gently flattened out, stable. Or I could just place them on my hips. A little harder to monitor what's happening in the lower back that way. And I'm going to bend that back knee. And again, press the heel down while my weight's forward and my knee is bent. Stranger sensation. Lower in the calf, deeper, different kind of stretching sensation, really. Returning to a normal stance. And I'm just going to shake the body a little bit. I'm bouncing on my heels, but keeping the knees very soft so it doesn't feel jarring at all. Just a light shaking and bouncing. Try to feel how that bounce or that vibration works its way up through the whole body, right to the crown of the head, and note any part of the body that doesn't feel like it's just lightly shaking or lightly bouncing. Any place that feels like it's a little dead or stiff. If any part of it feels jarring, give it a rest. Just take a break from that light bouncing. Shouldn't feel like it's jarring any part of the body. And then we're just going to pat the body a little bit, make sure the circulation's moving very freely, the muscles are all relaxed, and pat the chest a little bit. Down one arm, up the back of the arm, over the shoulder. Up the back of the arm again. Shoulder, I could always do that a few times. And coming down to the ribs. Abdomen, outer hips, lower back, back of the legs, over the hip bone, then the outer legs, inner legs, added every surface that I can comfortably reach. Yeah, shake out a little bit. That's a slightly more strenuous warm-up, a little bit more about the basic power dynamics of Tai Chi.